begin. We're ready to begin.
I'm not sure you'd have to talk to
Henry.
me
No. You're interfering with it. We just have to be able to give each other a hard time on the board. Anyway, I hope you all had a good lunch. And before I launch into our next presenter, I do want to tell you that our theme for next year is going to be entertainment. So we're going to be looking at various aspects of entertainment. Anyway, so I have to tell you a little story before I give the formal introduction. So just before the World Series, well, first let me start out by saying I grew up in Chicago, and as most of us that grew up in Chicago, I'm a die-hard Cubs fan. You know, we never give up, never ever. So just before the World Series starts, I'm in my home in Minnesota. Well, I'm actually on the road driving, and I'm listening to NPR, and I hear this wonderful interview. And it's all about the Cubs and the history of what's gone on. And the speaker is also talking about the World's Fair and some of the different aspects of changes in Chicago and everything. And I'm like, well, this is interesting, because our team had been looking for someone who could speak on World's Fairs and the innovation that was involved. And we specifically had thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find somebody who could talk about two World's Fairs at different periods of times in the same city? And so here I am driving along, and thunderbolt. I hear Russell Lewis talking about the Cubs and the World's Fair and the different things going on at the, well, and he changed the name now, so it's now the Chicago Historical Museum, Chicago History Museum. And I walk in the house and I go, what the heck, I'm going to go for it. Get on the internet, get the phone number, call, and guess who answers his own phone? So I got a chance to talk with Russell and invite him to speak with us, and we just couldn't be more thrilled. Russell Lewis is the Executive Vice President and Chief Historian of the Chicago History Museum. He's responsible for the day-to-day implementation of the museum's mission to creatively explore and showcase Chicago's history and culture, and to preserve, manage, build, and make accessible to the public the Chicago History Museum's collection of more than 22 million documents and objects. He's been a member of the Chicago Historical Society and the Chicago History Museum staff since 1982. He is the author of Historic Photos of Chicago's World's Fair, published in 2010, and has been involved in the development of numerous exhibitions, including Chicago, Crossroads of America, and has led a number of digitization projects, including the Great Chicago Fire and the Web of Memory, and the online version of the Chicago Encyclopedia. He has also served as project director for the $27.8 million renovation of the Chicago History Museum. And I'd like to point out that even though we featured one of his books in here, he's actually written multiple books. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the speaker that through tremendous serendipity is with us today.
Thank you, Barbara. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak before the Ephemeral Society. As it turns out, I actually know some people who are members, which I didn't realize until they saw that I was speaking, so that was a nice aspect of all of this. So I'm going to talk about innovation at Chicago's two World's Fairs today. And just to a little bit of a spoiler alert, I may not be talking about the things you might expect I would be talking about when it comes to innovation. So I just want to put that out there, not the usual suspects always. with respect to these two World's Fair, but I do hope that my presentation and my perspective will help broaden the conversation about innovation that has already occurred thus far at this year's conference. So I want to begin by placing the Columbian Exposition and the Century of Progress World's Fair in historical context. The idea of an international exposition or World's Fair grew out of the national fairs that were held in Britain and France in the 18th and 19th centuries. And those fairs presented innovations primarily in areas such as transportation, manufacturing, and mining. These expositions were organized generally to stimulate industrial development within a country, and were largely patriotic displays of economic and technological prowess and progress. The Great Exhibition of Industrial Works of All Nations, commonly referred to as the Great Exhibition or the Crystal Palace, because of the unique glass and iron structure designed for Hyde Park to host the event, was organized by Prince Albert in 1851. Prince Albert had two motives in mind in organizing this exhibition. On the one hand, he was a strong advocate for trade to substitute for war. On the other hand, this was also a very clear effort on his part to showcase Great Britain's status as the world's greatest industrial power. And while it failed in the first effort, of making trade a substitute for war, it certainly succeeded in the second effort. Like the national expositions that preceded it, it was organized largely according to industrial processes, as I said, manufacturing, mining, transportation. And it truly was a huge success and left an indelible mark on London and on the world. Although London hosted another fair in 1862, it was pretty much a failure. Didn't come close to the kind of fanfare and acclaim that the Crystal Palace exhibition had won. And Britain lost its position as the great innovator, not in industry, but in large-scale exhibitions. And it never hosted another exhibition in the 19th century. France and its Parisian fairs, beginning in 1855, so just 4 years after the Great Exhibition, emerged as the trendsetter and the most ambitious host of what it referred to as universal expositions. And although Vienna hosted a fair in 1873, and Philadelphia, and as you heard this morning, the Corliss engine image there, which ran the Philadelphia Fair, marked the centennial of America's founding in 1876. It was Parisian fairs held in 1855, 1867, 1878, 1889, and 1900 that set the standard for all subsequent fairs. Now the Paris fairs departed from the model of the national industrial exhibitions and the Great Exhibition in one very, very important way. Rather than focusing on industry, where France could not compete with Great Britain, it centered on luxury goods and consumer products, where it had really made a reputation for itself and a mark in the world, aiming at middle-class consumers as its primary audience for these universal expositions rather than industrialists. Thus, like its urban counterpart, the department store, which also emerged in Paris in the 1850s, these French World's Fairs depicted progress through just the sheer number of products, household, leisure, and luxury goods that were available to purchase, and presented them in fairly elaborate displays often using techniques to create fantasy-inspired environments. The Paris World's Fairs won the hearts and minds of a growing group of people who created their identity through the products they consumed. And as consumers, they felt they could contribute to and actively participate in the March of Progress. So the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition and the 1933-34 A Century of Progress Exposition embodied this Paris-centered, consumer-oriented approach in the way that they developed and carried out their exhibitions. So I just want to give you some local context for understanding the two Chicago fairs, and just give a little comparison in terms of some of the chief aspects of it. And so this shows the location where the two fairs were. The 1893 World's Fair on the south side in Jackson Park, and the 1933-34 World's Fair up in Burnham Park, right just south of Chicago's Loop. So the Columbian Exposition, and here's a plan of the fairgrounds, located on the south side of Chicago, they said, along Lake Michigan in Hyde Park, which had been an independent town and was annexed to Chicago in 1889. Located just east of the University of Chicago campus, of course, just a small scale version of what it is today, but it was there. Its 690-acre fairgrounds made it physically the largest World's Fair in the 19th century, and it stretched all the way from 56th Street there up on the north side down to 67th Street on the south, and from Lake Michigan, as you say, on the east to what is now Stony Island Drive on the west, and then the sort of strip that you see jutting out going to the west was the Midway Plaisance, and I'll have a little more to say about that. This is the Century of Progress World's Exhibition, which was sited in Burnham Park and on Northerly Island. So that's sort of Burnham Park on the side toward the bottom, stretching out, and then Northerly Island is on top there. As I said, located on Chicago's lakefront, just south of the Central Business District. The fairgrounds span 427 acres between 12th Street on the north and 39th Street on the south, Lake Michigan on the east, and Lake Shore Drive on the west. Soldier Field, the large athletic field you see there, sort of just above the center. The Adler Planetarium, which is up here at the top, and the Shedd Aquarium down here, sort of. Those two were built in 1932, so just prior to the fair's opening, and Soldier Field opened, I believe, in 1926. So they sort of formed a cultural sports sort of nexus in this area. So in some ways it was a logical place for this fair to open. So the Columbian Exposition opened May 1st, 1893, closed October 31st that same year, so it just opened for 6 months. Century of Progress opened May 22nd, 1933, closed November 12th, 1933, and then President Roosevelt decided that the fair should be open for another season because this was again in the middle of the Depression. He felt that the fair had been successful, and he thought that the American public needed this. And it also was a place to, again, promote the policies and actions of the Roosevelt administration. Interestingly enough, the fair had promised when it first opened that it was going to work closely with the African American community in Chicago, provide jobs, a lot of promises. It it was unable to keep. And so there was a strike prior to the opening of the second fair by African Americans, and they basically were able to keep the fair from opening until concessions were made to them. So there's a civil rights component to this story as well. So 27,300,000 people visited the Columbian Exposition over its 6-month period it was open. A Century of Progress attracted 41,769,000 plus visitors over its 2 seasons. The theme of the Columbian Exposition was celebrating progress since the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. And you might be saying, isn't 1893 the 401st anniversary of discovery of America? And you're right about that. Your math is very good. The fair was scheduled to open in 1892, and it was unable to open because of issues around building this just incredible, colossal fair. I mean, the fact that they got it done at all was something of a miracle. The Century of Progress celebrated the 100th anniversary of the founding of Chicago in 1833 and the growth of science over that century. So it had a very local aspect to its historical look back, but it really was a chance to look at what had happened in terms of the growth of especially science over that century. The motif of the Columbian Exposition was water, representing Columbus's voyage. And so when I show you some more images of the fair, just, you'll see a lot of water. There were basins, there was a lagoon, there were canals. So water was a very, very important theme around that idea of Columbus's voyage. Light was the motif for A Century of Progress, which was meant to sort of epitomize the power of science. And just as the Corliss steam engine sort of started the Centennial Exposition, it was light from a distant star that initiated the opening of the A Century of Progress exhibition. So a very kind of important symbolic start to the fair. The fairs were financed very differently. The Columbian Exposition was a private corporation financed through the sale of shares, and it realized a small profit through admissions and commissions, primarily through the profits generated by the Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel grossed over $750,000 in less than 6 months. That really pushed it over the top in terms of being in the black. Now, Parisian World's Fairs, everybody else's World's Fairs were financed by the state with maybe a little bit of private money, but Chicago 1893 was almost all private. It did receive a congressional appropriation, but it had to give the money back when the fair organizers decided to keep the fair open on Sunday to allow the working class to attend that fair. And then there was a group of what they call Sabbatarianists in Congress didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that the fair was open on Sunday, and they were able to pull that money back. And so Chicago was kind of on its own in terms of running this fair. But one of the great things we have, and I'm not sure I would call it ephemera, I mean, I think everybody has a different, maybe probably definition of that. But we have the concession agreements, and when you look at those, you see how lucrative they were and what really sort of tough contracts the fair organizers struck with these concessions to make sure that they got their money. A Century of Progress was a nonprofit corporation, and it was financed through membership and bonds which paid to the fair. So rather than buying shares of a private corporation, you basically, through your membership, that was able to float the bonds. And paid for the fair, and it was not in debt. The clue of each of these expositions were different. The Columbian Exposition was the Ferris wheel. Of course, this was an attempt inspired by the success of the Eiffel Tower, which was built for the 1889 Parisian World's Fair, to create something different. And there were many, many crazy, I mean, we've already seen a number of sort of absurd proposals for inventions or innovations. There were many to create a tower that would outdo the Eiffel Tower. One of them that's sort of memorable had 4 legs, each the size of the Eiffel Tower for the first platform, and went up from there. None of these were feasible, and in fact, Daniel Burnham did not want just another tower. He wanted something that was going to be completely novel, and that's when they struck the deal with George Washington Ferris for the Ferris wheel, but it came late. It didn't come until February of that year, and it was a very, very harsh winter, and so it didn't open when the fair opened. But just to remind you, it was still an observation wheel, so it did look to the Ferris wheel, to the Eiffel Tower for its inspiration. The Sky Ride at the Century of Progress, you'll see some images of that, was sort of the image that they used to sort of attract people to that. Hidden attractions were at the Columbian Exposition. Fatima, who did the belly dance on the Midway, and of course, about the song, and there's all kinds of myths about it, but we do know there were Egyptian dancers that do it was called the nervous dance, was the way they termed it because of the jiggling, but did a belly dance, and it was quite popular among the men. And at the Century of Progress World's Fair, also very popular, Sally Rand's balloon and feather dances. So some similarities there. Although there's a plethora of printed material related to the World's Columbian Exposition, there's a major photographic documentation. The archival record is almost non-existent. Nobody really knows what happened to all of these records. At the Chicago History Museum, we have a little bit. We have one of several letter books from the Board of Lady Managers, but the sort of kind of archival record that you would expect for an enterprise as important and as large as this, it's gone. So, ephemera has really played, I think, a really important role, therefore, in helping us comprehend and visualize the fair. So, tickets are very, very plentiful. I did pair a Chicago day with a Manhattan day, seeing that we're close to Manhattan. October 9th, of course, 1893. October 9th is the anniversary of the Chicago fire. In many ways, the fair was an attempt to prove to the world not only did Chicago survive its fire, but it thrived and is even better. But these kind of tickets are readily sort of available. We don't collect them anymore because we have so many of them. Different passes for the workers, whether they were vendors or construction workers. It took, several armies of workers to build this World's Fair. Sheet music. I was just talking to Steve Shepard, who's collector of Columbian Exposition material, and he was telling me about some sheet music that he was bidding on. So it's out there. I think probably the most popular piece was a sheet music for a song called After the Ball, which had everybody sort of humming. And music, played a huge role at the World's Fair. This is where John Philip Sousa really became popular. But every pavilion, whether it was a state pavilion or a foreign pavilion, or just in the little areas around the fair, would have bands, and there were often parades, marching bands, all kinds of music. It was a huge part of it. Postcards came, I think some of the first postcards were sent from the Columbian Exposition, and we have some of these in our collection. Lots of views of the World's Fair, whether they were photographs or based on engravings or lithographs or drawings. This is a cute little German produced souvenir. And then, of course, as you've seen earlier, trade cards. There are many, many trade cards, often promoting things of large scale, because that's what the fair was about. But these, they must have produced tens to hundreds of thousands of these kinds of cards. So it's not difficult to find lists of inventions from the fair. So things like the zipper, the moving sidewalk, kinescopes. There was even an early automobile at the fair. Of course, the Ferris wheel, postcards, the Yerkes reflecting telescope. In addition, a number of new products and brands familiar to us today were introduced, like Cracker Jacks, Juicy Fruit Gum, Cream of Wheat, Pass-Through Blue Ribbon Beer, and Aunt Jemima pancake flour. So these are all things that are associated, and again, you can make lots and lots of lists of things. This is only touching some of the most obvious ones, but I want to focus today on some additional innovations. As I said earlier in my sort of spoiler reverse, these might not be innovations that you have thought about or you would associate with the fair, but I think they're very important, and most importantly, they had a major impact on society. Well, the first one is very familiar to you, and that's electricity, because everybody is talking about electricity. The second one we'll talk about is the Women's Building. The third is the promotion of the fair. The fourth is I'm actually going to do a slightly different order here. The Midway, and then last I'm going to do sort of urban planning. So this is the electricity building at the fair, and that fountain in front of the fair, front of the building, is an electric fountain. Just so you know, that was run by electricity. So this is the electricity building. Was one of the main buildings that surrounded the Court of Honor, and it presented electricity as a positive force in people's lives. Now, electricity was, at this time, was a little sort of suspect. People didn't know what to make of electricity. It was a mysterious force. For some people, it was a frightening sort of advancement. They just didn't know. And how is it going to affect me as a person? What is it going to do for me? But what was so impressive and powerful about electricity at the fair was not just the displays inside the building. And here we see Tesla's Westinghouse display, and that is Edison's column behind it. And I'll talk in a minute about the sort of the battle between those two. But they used electricity to power parts of the fair, and to animate it in ways that had never been seen before. So, as I mentioned, the electric fountains. They had a moving sidewalk at the pier that, if you took a boat down to the fair, you could get off onto this moving sidewalk. They had electric boats through these lagoons and the basin. They had an elevated train, and most importantly, they had thousands of lights that illuminated the buildings and the attractions, like the Ferris wheel was lit up at night. So the decisions, it's been called the White City. The decision to paint the buildings white, I think there might have been an economic reason behind that as well that doesn't get put out. But again, since we don't have these archives, we don't know for sure. But one of the other reasons was they wanted to use colored lights at night to, again, sort of animate these buildings. So that's one of the reasons why things were painted white. And here you see this card for the Colombian Intramural Railway on the right there. You could see how you could get around at least sort of the perimeter of the fair on this electric intramural railway. Now, the Chicago L, as we call it, the elevated, at this time there was one, the South Shore Rapid Transit Company, called the Alley L, did go down from the loop down to the fairgrounds, but it wasn't electrified at this time. It was pulled by steam engines. It wasn't until a couple of years later that it was electrified. So this was really the first example of electricity for transportation on the fair. And then here we are looking, I believe, from the top of the Manufacturing Liberal Arts building down into the Grand Basin there, and you see this giant searchlight on the left. This is one of the most famous sort of images with the Colombian Guard, and then this typical visitor at the fair. But those kind of searchlights, and again, the illumination was just stunning. Now this isn't a very good image, there are some others, but it just gives you, we're looking now south in the basin. You can see that statue, Chester French's Statue of the Republic in front of us, and we're looking toward the dome of the administration building, agriculture building on the left, Manufacturing Liberal Arts on the right. But this was one of the, just sort of captivating, almost dream-like, ethereal kind of experiences that people had that they really couldn't have anywhere. Now, the fair was also where the showdown took place between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. They both exhibited, as you saw, new electrical technology in the electricity building, but the real showdown was over how electrical power would be distributed, and Tesla and his proposal for direct current won out over Edison and alternating current. So that was a big thing that happened at the fair.
I think it's the other way around.
Yes, the other way, I'm sorry. Yes. DC, yes. So the women's building, the fair was the first exposition to recognize the contributions specifically of women to progress, giving them their own building. This is one of the imitations, and then this is the building that was designed by architect Sophia Hayden. All of the exhibitions inside here and the whole enterprise with respect to women's role at the fair was organized by Bertha Honore Palmer. She was wife of Chicago business titan Potter Palmer, and she was a really very formidable person and a great art collector, and really made this happen. It would not have sort of happened without her. And so the women's building presented artwork by women. You can see some of the murals up in the top up there, and a tapestry over there. Mary Cassatt, I believe, did some of the murals, as well as advances in social work. And here's a German exhibition on kindergarten that was in there. So this acknowledgement of women built on, of course, the growing building interest in women's rights, and even this example, this acknowledgement and recognition of women contributed to the suffragette movement and the eventual passing of the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving women the right to vote. So promotion. The Columbian Exposition was the first World's Fair to have a dedicated department of promotion led by a gentleman named Moses P. Handy. It's a name you won't forget. It's got such a nice ring to it. And it successfully branded the fair by creating a sort of a Columbian progress narrative in print and image and in sculpture. And this is sort of the narrative written in exploitation of the World's Fair 1893 by Richard J. Murphy, who worked for Moses P. Handy. But this kind of documentation for promoting the World's Fair, perhaps, and then we have this kind of thing with Columbus up top, guide with Columbus, Ghost of Columbus. So there was a lot of Columbus throughout the fair, and one of the most important things that Moses P. Handy was able to do with advances in printing technology, he was able to distribute on a scale never before imagined specific images of the fair captured by C.D. Arnold, who held the sole license to make official photographs of the exposition. So this was when Brownie cameras were first introduced, and in our collection at the History Museum we have a number of these amateur photographs made with the Brownie camera. Usually it's a round sort of photograph, and you actually ship the whole camera in to have the film develop. But you had to pay a fee to bring the camera in and take photographs. And so this idea of having, a set of photographs that presented the fair as the organizers wanted to do was really important. And it was a way to control the image of the fair and to shape viewers' impressions and perceptions. And we take it for granted today that this is how you brand things, but it was fairly unique at this time for them to do something, especially on such a large scale. So the Midway Plaisance was envisioned as an entertainment zone that was coupled with anthropological displays of exotic culture. It was this, and here you see we have the Ferris wheel. We're looking east toward the lake, and you have the proper fairgrounds, and you have the Midway. The Midway was also meant to be kind of a safety valve overflow. If the fairgrounds got too crowded, they thought people could go out into the Midway, and then they would go out into the parks that connected that. It didn't really quite happen that way, but it was still sort of very successful. So it was dominated by and here we see the way the Midway was organized, and based on the presentation we had this morning about flight, I just wanted to point out this is where the captive balloon was. So you could not only go up on the Ferris wheel, you could get on a balloon that was tethered and look at the fairgrounds as well. Again, this sort of depicts, they said the international, this was a cosmopolitan sort of setting for people not only from Europe, because there was a German and an Austrian and an Irish display, but again, people from Samoa, from Africa, from all Eskimos were further onto the fairgrounds, but sometimes came down into this area as well. So the Midway also offered theatrical performances, again by Samoans, by the Turkish dancers there. There were captive animals, parades, musical performances, traditional arts and industries performed in, say, the German village and the Irish village, and of course thrilling rides, not only including the Ferris wheel, but the Barrie Ice Rail Ride. Yes. Yeah. Oh. I'm going to skip ahead then, because I haven't gotten to the 1893 World's Fair. I did the Century Progress. The only thing I want to say about this is that one of the things about the Midway that was so important is that it pushed or it brought people together in these sort of crowded condition, it sort of forced different classes and races to mix and share social space. That was not typical in the 19th century. There were all kind of reasons why people didn't want to do that, and they felt uncomfortable. So ironically, this was a sort of harbinger of our modern world today, and although nobody realized it, they were actually experiencing the future there on the Midway. All right, so I'm running out of time, so I'll skip ahead. Just say urban planning was one of the also chief innovations that grew out of the Columbian Exposition. Where is it there? Up on the right, the Court of Honor in that basin created these sort of majestic buildings. They were awe-inspiring to people. People had never seen anything like this. It was orderly. It was beautiful. People felt good. There was no crime. And here's another view looking to the east. And so this was the inspiration for the City Beautiful movement. Why can't we apply these same principles to cities? And so Daniel Burnham was sort of the chief promoter of this idea, and he worked in creating the Washington Mall, transforming that into a public space. Manila in the Philippines, he worked in Cleveland, and he also then came up with a plan for Chicago. So this is the Century of Progress exposition. Just real quickly, we'll talk about the innovations in terms of modern architecture, streamlined transportation and products, corporate sponsorship, color, and modern lifestyle. So that's another view. This was sort of traditional sort of symbol for Chicago, but this really became the accepted logo for the World's Fair. It sort of represented a more clear look to the future, which was very much important during the Great Depression. So as opposed to the World's Fair, which had these sort of Beaux-Arts classical buildings, the Century of Progress had modern buildings with sleek surfaces. They used innovative materials like masonite, plywood, anything that was cheap during the Depression, and it created flat surfaces, and those flat surfaces were free of ornamentation, and what they used instead to accent the architecture was color. So this was sort of large-scale architecture with incredible color sort of applied to it. This is the Hall of Science, again showing that use of lighting was also very important, as well as color. This was again the Federal Building there in the fairgrounds. And you can see in the background some of the sort of the color, at least in this illustration of the fair. So transportation was very important. The Burlington Zephyr made its maiden voyage from Denver to Chicago on the opening day of the fair in 1934. This was the first, America's first diesel streamline train. Streamline was an important concept. And train manufacturers had seen, or the railroads had seen a decline in passenger traffic due to the rise of the automobile, but also during the Depression they had seen a decline in freight traffic. So they tried to figure out what's a way we can reinvent the railroad and get our passenger traffic back up. And so they came up with this stainless steel streamlined train. Again, it made its maiden voyage from Detroit to, from Denver to Chicago and set a new world's record. And then it parked itself here at the Century of Progress exposition where people could see it. It's debatable today even whether streamlining really is a more efficient design or really helps with speed, but it was a great marketing tool. And so streamlining then is a concept that was used to design radios and vacuum cleaners and all sorts of appliances. This is the Skyride with its sort of streamlined cabs that you could go across the lagoon there. It didn't have quite the same novelty as the Ferris wheel. And then again, as I mentioned, color. Color was incredibly important to the World's Fair because it was building on the concept that advertisers and other people used, that color was one of the ways that you could sell new products. And again, since this was a fair that was aimed at consumers, it was about selling products as well. And here we see some of the great sort of colors. What was also unusual, as opposed to having things like the electricity building and a manufacturer's building, they had a lot of buildings that were sponsored by corporate entities like General Motors, Firestone, Ford, and then finally, because I know I'm out of time, I just want to say one of the most popular displays was the Houses of the Future exhibition, where they had houses made out of, the previous one was made out of masonry, this one was made out of stainless steel. You see it was brought to you by Good Housekeeping. This one was out of wood. There was even a cypress log house, and then they had the Florida house. So in the end, you saw, over 40 million people came. They saw, they were amazed. And I think what's important, even though I've drawn more of a contrast between the two fairs, the thing that stands out for me was this idea that progress and innovation have to have a very strong marketing and sort of promotional component to get the middle class to literally buy into it and sort of buying these sort of consumer goods. So I apologize that I sort of got stuck in the first part of my presentation, but thank you very much.